Thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, this is the first episode of our podcast, so you're breaking it in, and I think you're going to do well because it's a very important topic. So appreciate you coming by. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and talk a little bit about the Citizens Climate Lobby in general.
Sure. So I'm Topher Anderson. I'm the co-leader of Citizens Climate Lobby, and I have been for about the last 18 months. And that's just a Citizens Climate Lobby Indianapolis.
Mm-hmm.
Citizens Climate Lobby nationally is a group of bipartisan, laser-focused volunteers that are working to pass environmental legislation that both stops climate change and protects those who are lower and middle income from any rise in energy costs.
Okay.
So we do that. We have chapters all across our country. There's like 6 here in Indiana, and we cover 85% of congressional districts.
Mm-hmm.
And what's really important to the way that we work is that we invite our representatives and our senators to build relationships with their constituents and to be influenced by their constituents, which is us, so that ultimately they represent their constituents more than anybody else, and more than any funder, more than any lobbyist. They're here to represent us, and so we really try to give them the resources to do that. And so that's led to a bill we have in Congress now that we're really excited about, and that's the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. So
okay.
Yeah,
well, I was going to ask you a little bit about that. Now, is this the same as the Green New Deal that we've heard so much about lately, or is this different, or is it a piece of it, or?
That is a great question.
Okay.
So it's a really great parallel, I think, because when I was in DC in November, I was there with about 700 other Citizens Climate Lobby volunteers from all around the country, lobbying our congresspeople to educate them on our legislation and how this would protect the poor and reduce climate change. And that same day, we were there as the Sunrise Movement, which was a group of young professionals, students, decided to protest and become arrested on the Hill because they were angry at the lack of a Green New Deal, which is vital to addressing climate change. And so we are of different paths, and the Green New Deal has gained so much traction and has brought so much energy and adrenaline really to the climate change conversation, which is like incredible to see, but we are different right now. I think, and I would hope, that any Green New Deal that gets passed uses the same equitable carbon price that is really a key to making sure that we reduce climate change and protect those who are poor. So.
Now there was correct me if I'm wrong, but during the midterm election in Seattle, there was a similar thing. Is this the same as that, where they would charge just per like metric ton of carbon? Like is that am I thinking of that right? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. And actually Citizens Climate Lobby was involved with that.
Okay.
But that is not like the same blow for blow. In that the difference is that the federal legislation currently in front of Congress takes all that money collected by the fee, and then it redistributes it back out to every American citizen, which was not the case in Washington where that bill was defeated. So we think that that's really important because it creates jobs across the country because you're putting money back into local economies. But also, those who are on a fixed income, like if you put a fee on carbon, they're not going to be able to pay their gas bills, their heating. And we think that that's not acceptable. No policy can, oppress those who are already underprivileged. And so that dividend gives them the ability to continue to pay their day-to-day living expenses and not be burdened by a transition to a cleaner economy. So it's similar, but not quite the same.
Okay. What kind of objections are you hearing from either people? I assume there's going to be interests in business that are going to be against this. What have you heard in the way of opposition to this?
I think really it's interesting because we are so focused on bipartisanship that the main objection we hear is that it's not fully what either side of the political spectrum expects out of a solution. So our plan is revenue neutral. It doesn't increase the size of government. And we hear from those who are left of center that that's really frustrating. They think the government can fix this. And from those who are right of center, they're upset that we're intervening in the market at all. And so really the objections we hear are from those extremes that are concerned that this isn't exactly how their ideology perceives a solution. So that's really the main one we hear. We also hear objections about, this happened in France. France put fee on carbon, and then we see the yellow vests. But again, that piece that was missing was a dividend. Is truckers and others were upset that they were being charged more to do their day-to-day jobs, and we don't think that's acceptable. And so that dividend is there to offset that. And we've shown in economic studies that I think it's the lower 2/3 of the income scales would actually make more money off of that dividend than they're going to lose to that rise in energy costs. So that's the objections we hear, but a lot of it is just there's so many different minds are around different. Makes sense.
No, it does, and it does make sense that both extremes are kind of finding it somewhat problematic, but I can also see pluses for both of the extremes too. Like, it seems like if you do like a market-based solution like this, that seems to be in line with what a Republican or a conservative would think was, because it's not, like you said, it's not a government thing expanding, but at the same time, on the other end, people on the lower end of the income spectrum are the ones consistently we see that are impacted by climate change more, just worldwide. That's
absolutely,
those are the people that bear the brunt of it, right away. So that wasn't really a question, but.
No, absolutely though. That's I think that's so many of what your solution is about who you look at, and I think absolutely your eyes have to be fixed on those who suffer the effects of it. And like you said, worldwide, it's always those who are poor.
Absolutely. Now let's shift a little bit to the Green New Deal, because people have been talking about it so much lately.
Sure.
Could you just explain, because the first time that we got to know each other is you did the op-ed for NUVO about the Green New Deal. So you've written about this in the past, but just real quick for people that don't know, they hear the words, but they don't know what it means. What does it mean, Green New Deal?
Sure.
Say real quick.
So the Green New Deal has kind of become this great moniker to indicate just this desire for sweeping legislation that absolutely transform our economy to be sustainable, renewable energy, and just, it's hard to fully answer that question because it's not yet fleshed out. Ocasio-Cortez, the senator, introduced that said we would transition entirely to renewable energies within 10 years, and we would eliminate air travel. And a lot of those were these great aspirational views, but still what exactly it means is still being fleshed out in the political and public sector. But it's really this desire of our government owes it to the people to change our economy to prevent climate change. We're the largest polluter in the world, besides China, and we have the largest pollution per capita. And so we as a country owe it to our citizens to do something about that. So that's really what the Green New Deal is about.
Right. And it doesn't even seem, it does seem like a more left-leaning thing, but it also seems like an age thing, because of course we saw those students, or whatever, confront Dianne Feinstein, and she was like a little bit dismissive of what they had to say about it. We have the people who were suing, the young people suing because the government's not doing enough about climate change. So it's like, if you're old, not to be too blunt about it, but you're not going to be here as long as people like you and I. My kids, I have 2 kids, they're going to be dealing with this, their whole lives, and I have to think about the future. So it almost seems like young people get this and the older people just don't. Like, what can we do to convince the old people to get on board with this? Because it's like, yeah, you may not have to deal with this, you had your fun with the earth, we still got time that we still need it. What can you say to those people who are skeptical? Well, we don't want to spend this much and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think the first thing I would honestly do is challenge that narrative a little bit, because it's Citizens Climate Lobby, so our local chapter is about 30 really dedicated people that meet regularly, and a good half of them are baby boomers, who have retired and find this to be like the most riveting moral issue that they need to solve, whether it be for themselves or for their grandchildren. In my experience, I've seen it across the political spectrum and across the age spectrum. To those who continue to struggle to get it, as you say, I think what I'd say to them is that this doesn't you don't need to change who you are to get on board with supporting climate change legislation. So you don't need to, if you don't think, if you're older and more conservative and believe, the government shouldn't intervene in all your values to do this, you need to work from where you are, and there are solutions to climate change. Like, across the age spectrum that we can all agree on. And it doesn't need to be a wedge issue. Climate change doesn't need to be an issue that tears families and communities apart. It can be something upon which we all agree, here are common sense solutions that literally address climate change at its core. Let's do those together. Let's come at places of common ground before we look for places of difference. And I think that that's something that right now is really missing in the climate change discussion. And I think that's why we've seen it stall for 8 years. Nothing has happened in like 8 years. Obama made some really great strides, and then they all got repealed because there's no common ground that we stand on as the pendulum swings back and forth. And I think
I think calling it a Green New Deal is probably a good idea, because if you think of the original New Deal, I mean, that was in response to another giant crisis, the Depression. And, that brought us out of the Depression. We still have so many programs that we continue, it's untouchable today. Yeah. Or virtually, well, who knows? But that was another case of a huge problem. And, and when we talk about government and not wanting government to be involved, but government is just people, and it's just enough people getting together and doing the same thing at the same time. And it's just, when you hear the word government, it's like, oh, government, but it's like, there's, highway system, the original New Deal, the Medicaid, Social Security, all that stuff is incredibly popular, and that all came from that era. And I feel like if you can just frame the problem in that explosive of a term, like, this is as big as the Depression, this is as big of a thing, it's, I don't know. Again, not a question, but I think it's good branding for the Green New Deal.
Absolutely.
I'm excited that they went with that direction, because
it's been it's so exciting to see Democratic presidential candidates. Everyone gets asked about the Green New Deal. That has not been a present. As someone who really is deeply concerned about climate change, you never see it in the the political specter to be asked about those commonly. Right. In the Indiana federal elections, there was one question about it, and the answers that were given were vague. So it's, like you said, it's amazing branding, and it's so good to see this happening. What I like to also remember about the Green New Deal, though, is that it wasn't one legislation. The Green New Deal was an era of multiple pieces of legislation, like you said, that got all those things done. And I think that's the same approach we have to take now, is let's take the best first step, and then after we do that, let's take the next best step to continue to plug the holes in the sinking ship. Right. We have to do this step by step, and let's take huge steps, but let's not think we have to solve this all in one piece of legislation or all at once. Right.
Well, and I also think that people are always like, oh, this is too much, we need to do just smaller stuff, but you got to remember, when you throw things out a little bit further, you're setting the first expectation. You can work backwards from there. You can do less if that doesn't make sense. But like you said, it's people have to say that first, and then people will catch up in some way, even if it's not all the way to where the first marker was thrown down. At least somebody throws out that first marker and says, "Here's where we'd like to be, and let's try to work towards that." But it's just. What do you get that criticism that this is just too much? We should do less. Do you think it's important to throw those markers out real far and try to get to them, or do you think it's let's just do this thing first, so step by step, incremental?
Are you referring to the Green New Deal or the? Okay. Green New Deal, yeah. I think I understand the importance of those aspirational goals. Absolutely, we need to know what we want at the end of the tunnel. But I also think that if you're going to have those aspirational goals, you need those next step goals as well. You need to say, look, I don't know exactly what it looks like at the end of the tunnel, but I know that this next step gets us 30 or 40% of the way there, so let's take this. And then after that, all right, let's take this next step. I don't think you can drive through a car tunnel and, I guess, in one step. That doesn't make sense. Right. But I think it's a both. You have to have aspirational goals, but you have to have strategies to get there.
Right, that makes sense. Now, I saw in your notes that you sent me, you wanted to talk about optimism, focus, and bipartisanship, and relationship building. And I think this is my hardest thing with talking about this, is I just read some of these climate reports, and I'm like, oh my God, I don't want to get out of bed. Okay, what am I supposed to do with this? How do you remain focused and optimistic and try to work with people on this?
Sure. I think, so one of my favorite quotes that kind of gets me up every day is this understanding that optimism is a political act that you get to make. There are plenty who continue to benefit from the status quo of there's nothing we can do about it, but the decision to say I can do something about this and to put your nose to the grindstone and do that is the most courageous political act you can make. And I think that's what the Green New Deal is doing, and that's what our legislation, the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, is doing. It's saying we can do something about this. And the other piece of that is like you mentioned, is integrity and relationships. I think in my day-to-day work, we meet with our representatives, each of our representatives and our senators 4 times a year. And I'll hopefully be out in June meeting with them on the Hill. And I have found that regardless of how much you disagree with a representative or a senator, all of them are doing their best to serve their constituents. That's been something that I think is so vital, is to thank them and say thank you for accepting this job with moderate pay, crazy work hours, and a huge strain on your family. Thank you. Now let's get to the issue, and let's talk about that, how we can come to a solution together. And we found with that model of recognizing that even our representatives are people, we've talked with Susan Brooks, and 4 years ago when we started our relationship with her, there were no public statements on climate change. There was nothing. And now she has signed on to House Resolution 195, which was a Republican resolution saying something needs to be done about climate change, and it's man-made. And that was this model of what, we would just ask, what do you need? Why don't you get on board, and what's holding you back? And then she might say, oh, I need to hear from my constituents here, and then we would bring those constituents to the next meeting. And I think that recognition, just that across the political spectrum, across any ideology, we're all American citizens working to make a vision of America better. And I think that that's just so core, and I'd love to drive that home.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I appreciate your optimism. I hope it's in
I hope it works.
Yeah, for sure. Is there anything else? I didn't ask you, that's all the questions I had, but how can people get involved, and how can people help with this Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, with the Citizens Climate Lobby more generally? Sure.
Could I talk briefly about what the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act is, what it does on the...
No, leave. No, I'm kidding.
Get out of here.
Get out of here. How dare you? Go
So, because I think this just really illustrates those strategic next steps towards an aspirational goal. So the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, if implemented as it is now, would reduce our carbon emissions by 40% over the next 12 years and 90% by 2050. It would create 2.1 million jobs across the country. It would save 300,000 lives due to reduced air pollution. And the way that it does that is, I always like to use this image of I'm sitting on this chair. I want this part to stay stable, right? So this is my climate. So if I'm going to do that, I have to have 4 solid legs that hold it up. And so the way that it does that is the first leg is just a small but steadily increasing fee on carbon. And what that does is it tells businesses and individuals that if you want to, especially businesses, if you want to continue to remain profitable, you need to clean your supply chain. Now it costs you to pollute. So you need to innovate your way out of this solution 10, 15 years down the road. The second leg, like we talked about, is it takes all that money, puts it in a giant pot, and then gives it to every American citizen, which is really, really vital and very different than anything we've seen, because it protects those lower and middle income families, and it also, throughout the country, throughout rural and urban economies, it creates jobs, which is, try to tell a politician that they don't want to create jobs. That's a huge boon.
Right.
The third leg is that it actually puts an adjustment at the border. So if I want to export a really carbon intensive good, I'll actually get some of the money that I paid back. And vice versa, if China wants to export a really carbon intensive good, they have to pay. And so what that does is it tells the rest of the world, if you want to be a part of the American economy, you pay for the price you put on pollution. You can't move your business abroad and then avoid paying the costs. And that protects our businesses, and it hopefully would encourage countries around the world to put their own price on carbon. It really starts this international domino effect. And the last leg is that it puts a regulatory freeze for the next 10 years. So what that means is just that for the next 10 years, the EPA can't put regulations on carbon dioxide, which right now there's none. So it's not like any rollback of any sort, but all it's saying is that for the sake of stability for those businesses, which are already going to be transforming, you can't kind of double jeopardy them for the next 10 years. And then if we're not reaching our Paris Accords, then the EPA has the right to regulate again. So that's kind of our policy. And we hope that as a Green New Deal takes off, or as the Republican Party increasingly embraces their need to address climate change, this is the first step. Regardless of political affiliation, we can do this part together. So
great. Well, thank you so much for coming by.
Thank you for having me. It's been wonderful.
Absolutely. Sweet.